everyone, welcome to a new video, welcome to my channel. My name is Maaike. Today I'm going to be giving you sort of like the roundup of my 2019 reading year. We're going to talk a little bit about stats, and then I'm also going to be talking to you about my best and worst books of 2019. So before we get into anything else, let's talk about my reading year in review first. I set myself the Goodreads goal every year to read about 50 books. Which is attainable if I throw in lots of like easy, simple books. But definitely this year I read quite a few like bigger books actually. There were quite a few like over 500 pages. So I'm pretty proud of myself that I still made it till like 45 or 46. I'm not entirely sure of the total. I do know how many pages I read. I read a total of 18,375 pages, which is great. It's just under what I read last year. And then I read fewer books. So in 2018, I read 42 books, I believe, and I read close to 19,000. So, but it seems to be that sort of like 18,000 pages is like where it's at for me in terms of how much I read in a given year. I definitely also read a variety of things. If I look at this like authors and what gender they have, I read mainly female authors, and then like a quarter of what I read was by male authors. I also read a little bit in different age categories, but I mainly, like about 75% of what I read was adult fiction, and everything else was either YA or children's fiction, because I started rereading some of my favorite children's books towards the end of the year. So that sort of put that tally in there. In terms of genre, there's a quite equal spread of different genre apart from fantasy. I definitely read mostly fantasy this year. About a third of my reading was in that genre, but then I also read a couple of historical fiction books. I also read some sci-fi. I read some biographies as well, so that was something that was new to me, so that was quite exciting. And then in terms of rating, it was sort of all over the place. I didn't read as many like books that really wowed me. So there weren't a lot of 5-star reads for me in 2019. I only had 3. I did have like the next runner-up, which was 4.5 stars, was like the biggest category. So I didn't have a really bad reading year, but most of those books I read in the first half of the year. I had a major reading slump at the end of 2019, which I think is why I didn't hit my target, but it always happens to me at some point in the year that I sort of start lagging behind, and that's just what happens. And I think that I know what the culprit was as well. So it's not as if I read a lot of bad books per se, in the sense that I had a couple of 2-star reads, but for me, sort of like 3 stars are books that I still very much enjoyed, but that I don't see myself rereading or not continuing on with the series, but I still enjoyed the read. It's when we get in the lower end of the spectrum that I'm really not that enthusiastic about it. There were no 1-star reads for me, but I did DNF one book, which was an audiobook, and that's a trend, because in 2019 I definitely also started listening to audiobooks for the first time a bit more, and I really enjoyed that, but also very much at the bottom end of the spectrum of my ratings are a lot of the audiobooks that I read. So I mentioned DNFing one audiobook, and that was the autobiography by Eddie Izzard. I really enjoy his comedy shows, so I was looking forward to him reading his own autobiography, but like his comedy, he meanders a lot, and he sort of goes into like footnotes, and then there's a footnote inside a footnote, and if you're listening to it, you get so sidetracked that you no longer remember what the main storyline was that he was trying to tell. And it could like go on for like a good couple of minutes before you would get back onto the story. So I read, I think, a good couple of hours, and it was just not enjoyable for me. I lost track of everything, and that's when I decided that this wasn't for me. So out of the other 4 that are right at the bottom of my list of like worst books of 2019, there are another 3 audiobooks, you guys. So these were all 2-star reads for me. The first one was Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall. Please don't shoot me. It's a very famous historical fiction novel, but what I didn't know going into this story is that the one that I listened to, while very enjoyable to listen to it, was the abridged version. So it wasn't the actual book. So it was like 7 or 8 hours, so I felt that it was sort of like cutting corners, but it still felt slow. So I'm not sure whether I would actually want to read the actual series, because I believe it's a series. It was enjoyable to listen to because the narrator of the story was really well chosen, I think. I'm not sure what the actor's name is, but he played Cousin Matthew in Downton Abbey in the first 3 seasons. And he just has a really enjoyable voice to listen to, and that made it so much easier to listen to. I know that on the page, apparently some of the perspective changes can be quite confusing, but I felt that because I listened on audio to this, I never really had that problem because he sort of adapted his voice whenever there was a different character on the page. It just kind of dragged. It wasn't all that interesting. I felt that when the story ended, that was like where it would have gotten interesting, so I didn't really care for the characters all that much. So that's why the story was a two-star read for me. And the other 2 audiobooks that I gave 2 stars are nonfiction. I thought that this was a great way to consume some more nonfiction. I read Bad Feminist by Roxane Gay, and it just bored me to tears. I did finish it in the end, but a lot of the chapters they just didn't really bring things home for me. I thought this was going to be about like feminism and all that, and parts of it are, but parts of it are also about her Scrabble habits and how she was trying to become a Scrabble regular. That to me just really wasn't interesting at all. So there were some chapters that were really enjoyable, but others I was like, why is this here? And it just didn't really make a lot of sense. The ones where she definitely got a little bit more into like her feminist perspectives that I really enjoyed, but there was like 75% of the book that was like, what's the use? I don't know. And the same actually went for Mark, what's his name? Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a. This is a book that I saw so much at like railway stations, and I saw a lot of people reading it, so I wanted to see what the fuss was all about. And I listened to it, and he sort of promised you that he's going to give you like 10 steps for like making your life easier to handle. And he sort of goes through those those 10 steps in like the first 30 minutes of the audiobook. And then the rest of it is like kind of pointless, because then he starts repeating himself. There's just a lot of anecdotes of how he did it. And then it just, I don't know, it just didn't make a lot of sense to me. And there were a lot of open doors in that one. And I find a lot of these like self-help kind of books are usually like, I already knew that, you know, it's just not interesting enough, but they usually end up being bestsellers, which I always find very interesting how that happens. There's only one book, which was a 2.5 star read for me, that I finished not too long ago, which is this one. So The Darkest Mind trilogy by Alexandra Bracken is a very famous YA dystopian series. I didn't know much about it going into it, and I quite liked the first one, but I thought the main character was a bit whiny, and that her decisions just weren't really gelled out very well in the plot line. And I just felt that whatever was not enjoyable about the first one, this one took it and amped it up a notch, which is why I gave this just 2.5 stars. It meandered a lot. There was no point to some of the things that were happening in this book as well. And one thing that really annoys me about this is that towards the end of a chapter, you get like the idea of something going to happen, and then you turn the page to start your next chapter, and then sometimes you don't get the action of what actually happened, but you get the aftermath straight away. So you're left with this blank where you're like, what? And you just went through like pages of people just moaning about how cold they are and how everybody hates them. And I'm like, you just skipped the most interesting part. So for me, the writing style just didn't really gel with me. I didn't like the main character, and you're inside her head all the time. So it's quite tedious to then go through. And it just, I don't know, I just suspect that in this case, this book is very much written like one step at the time. And it didn't really feel like there was a plan underlying the whole plot, where you sort of felt like you were going somewhere. It was just like action, 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 and then it was like connected with like lots of dialogue. And I'm like, people stuck in a car driving around in a dystopian world. It it just wasn't really interesting, and that's why I've decided to not even continue with the third book. Because I was curious what people thought of the third book, I started reading what some people had said, like spoilery reviews. A lot of people are saying that the first, like, good 2/3 of the third one are very boring and lead to nowhere, because it's just a bunch of people on a ranch doing nothing. And then all the action happens in the last 200 pages. And having already gone through that experience with this book, I don't want to, like, bully myself even more and do that to myself. So that's why this one went on the not so great list. But let's make sure that we end this video on a high note, and let's talk about things that I really enjoyed this year. So I read quite a few bigger books, and a lot of the bigger books I read ended up being some of my favorites. I gave this one 4.5 stars, and this deserves a mention because, as you can see behind me, I have very nicely filled bookshelves. But some of those books have been sitting on my shelf for years, and I just hadn't gotten around to them. Case in point, The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. And this was a book I really enjoyed. It's sort of about Dracula and trying to find Dracula, and this girl getting into the footsteps of her dad, who found this, like, mysterious letter, and then one day he disappears and she's trying to find him and all that. And sort of like the same thing happened to him with his PhD supervisor, who just, like, suddenly one day disappeared. So this is pretty hefty read. It sort of takes you all the way throughout Europe, and goes to, I don't know, it goes to Turkey, it goes, like, all across Europe, because the dad tells this story to his daughter on their mutual travels, and in the meantime she's also trying to piece everything together. So it's a bit like a detective thing, but at the same time there's a lot of history, there's a lot of travel, and it's got vampires. So I was pretty happy with it. It's not like an action-packed, like, ooh, vampire kind of novel. This is definitely the one where the writing is really important, and that was something I really enjoyed about this book. The writing of this is beautiful, and that's one thing I really appreciated, and it really kept me reading, even though it's a big one. So in terms of plot, there isn't a whole lot going on. It meanders, but if it's well written, I don't really mind it. And this was just, I don't know, for me, a new take on, like, Dracula stories, because I've read quite a few by now. And this was just really enjoyable. I like how this all came together in the end as well. It was just a really good one. So that's why I gave it 4.5 stars. So my next 4.5 star read was something that needs an honorable mention, because it's been a book in Dutch. And this book was very much raved about in Dutch press. And it's the first time, you guys, since secondary school that I read a Dutch book. And for me to be interested in a Dutch book and what it does is quite unique, because, as you will see, I mostly read in English, but Dutch is my native language. And I just hadn't really read much Dutch literature, because this was stuff they made us read in school, and I never really enjoyed it. And it was my Dutch teacher who sort of ruined my joy for reading growing up. So for me, reading in Dutch just has a really bad aftertaste. So for me to willfully, voluntarily pick up a book in Dutch was quite something. The only reason why I didn't give this 5 stars is the writing style. It is a little bit contrived and a little bit superfluous at times. But I did feel that what this story does and everything that happens in it, I laughed out loud. I thought it was ridiculous at times, but it also is right bang smack on the money, I feel. So this is Grand Hotel Europa by Ilja Leonard Pfeiffer. And this is a book that sort of takes a really old decaying hotel as like this sort of metaphor for Europe and how it's sort of changing. And then it also sort of talks about mass tourism in Venice and also in like places in the Netherlands that are just being run by tourists, you could say. And it sort of looks at those sort of issues that have come with people moving around a lot more, but also like just changing times, and you have all these characters that are like stand-ins for either other European countries, so it's a very clever book, I feel. It also touches upon migration and things like that, so it just really touches upon really important aspects of modern life, and it's very well written down in quite a hefty book, I have to say. But I really liked it. It was a book that I felt that I could sometimes skip certain passages because it wasn't always as useful, because it was very descriptive at times, and I definitely had to get used to like the layout of a Dutch book because it's done differently. Like layouting works differently in different languages, and I knew that going into it, but I hadn't realized how much it would affect me. I'm like used to reading English so much that for me, a lot of the punctuation and the layouting of this just felt a bit weird. And it definitely took me a good couple of like chapters to get into it. And then once I felt like, okay, I can skip certain sections, I went through it a little bit more quickly as well. The writing of it, as I said, is a little bit like bombastic, superfluous, contrived. Like he's really trying to show you that he knows language, and at times that's enjoyable, but not for an entire book like this. I felt it was a bit over the top at times, but the humor in this was absolutely lovely, and that's why I gave this book 4.5 stars. But I had 3 5-star reads in 2019. The only audiobook that was given that title, that honor, is Heroes by Stephen Fry. I have this as a physical copy, which was kindly gifted to me by one of my students. So sweet. And I decided to listen to it in audio because I figured out that Stephen Fry had narrated the book himself. And, you know, Stephen Fry narrated the Harry Potter audiobooks as well, and he did a great job on that. Love those. So I decided that I was just going to listen to it, and it was great. It was a bit weird though, because it's set in Greece, and he gave certain characters like Scottish accents. That was weird. But I thought it was very enjoyable, and it made the stories come alive even more than if I had read it on the page, I think. So yeah, this was a great one. I love his retellings of these myths. He also did Mythos, which I read last, like 2018. And this was just great. It sort of continues where that left off, because this is about all of the heroes in Greek mythology, whereas Mythos is much more like the origin story. So it's a really nice way to brush up on my knowledge of mythology. So for me, I think the familiarity of some of the books that I gave 5 stars was also why they ended up being 5 stars. Case in point, Lethal White by Robert Galbraith, aka J.K. Rowling. This is her detective series, and I don't hear a lot of people talking about this, but I love this book. I thought the one before this was a bit, not sure where it was going to go, but this is exactly why I fell in love with this series. If you don't know what this is about Cormoran Strike, who is a detective. He came back from the war, he's a veteran, he misses part of his leg, so... and that sort of features in the story quite heavily. He has an assistant called Robin, and she's really coming into her own in this story as well. This has political intrigue. It's got a murder mystery. I thought it was perhaps, again, the size of this, perhaps a bit long, because there is a murder that happens sort of like halfway through the book that I saw coming, and then you still need to get the resolution of that. So there's quite a lot of buildup in this. Not gonna lie, but I felt that this never dragged. It hit all the marks for me, and I really like it. So I'm glad that this was a lot better than the previous installment of this series. And then last but not least, my last 5-star read was Daphne du Maurier's Jamaica Inn. So this was an author I had heard of, but I hadn't really read anything by her, and then I saw her books in my local bookstore, and I picked up this one and Rebecca. I think Rebecca is actually her more famous novel, but I decided to read this first because I don't know, this is the reason why I wanted to pick up some of her books. And this is about a girl called Mary who, after her family all dies, she needs to move in with her uncle who owns this bar called the Jamaica Inn, and very soon she already finds out that there are just things going on in this bar, and that her uncle isn't necessarily a very savory person. So she tries to sort of unravel that mystery as well. It's very gloomy. It's almost like written in this like gothic style. And that's something that I really liked. This was very atmospheric, very dark, very, yeah, just really up my street. I love dark things and like a little bit of an unreliable narrator, and she doesn't really know who to trust and who she can really rely on. And I sort of really like that aspect of the story. Plus the writing of this, you guys, this was brilliantly written. It keeps you in the dark just long enough, but it also sort of, you know, gives you enough clues that you can figure out yourself what's actually going on. And just the way this was written was incredibly stunning. Right, so there you have it. Those were my top 5 reads of 2019. We'll see what 2020 will bring. I'm going to be doing some videos on that as well. So if you'd like to know what books I'm looking forward to that will be released this year, or if you would like to know what books I'm hoping to get to in 2020, then definitely stay tuned because I will be filming those videos as well. So that will be coming your way very soon. I hope you enjoyed this one for the time being. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next week. Bye!